If you would, take your seats. Well, we are very pleased to end the day with a panel sponsored by the Inter-American Defense Board. And we're honored to have as the moderator Ambassador Mendez from Belize, who here in Washington wears many hats. The Belizean ambassador to the United States, the ambassador and permanent representative of Belize to the OAS, and at the OAS he is the chairman of the Committee on Hemispheric Security, which had a meeting this afternoon, and he is here, as members of the board knew he would be. And so we're very pleased to have you, sir. We have just a quick reminder. We will have some bus transportation for anyone who would like to hop on a van to go to the Inter-American Defense Board for the reception after the panel, and it'll be immediately out in front. So we hope to see you there. Yes, Kelly. It will come back to Crystal City. Yep. So that's what we said we were going to do, and we figure that most people are in a hotel at Crystal City. There is a metro very close by, Pentagon City or Crystal City. We can get people to a metro as well from there. So I think it works out very nicely. Ambassador Mendez, sir, I'm going to turn control over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hope. I know how difficult it is to stay awake after lunch, so I will try to be as brief as possible and as pointed as possible so you don't fall asleep, or else I might fall asleep myself. First of all, I want to start by saying a very big thank you to the organizers of the 15th Annual Western Hemisphere Security Colloquium for honoring me with the invitation to be here this afternoon. I am looking forward to the presentations of such a learned panel, and I wish I had more time to be able to listen. I was looking through the programs, and I saw how pertinent and how really sophisticated sounding some of the areas being covered are. And I thought it would really have benefited from being able to spend a little more time with you, but I'm sure we will have access to the presentations afterwards. So first of all, thank you very much. I'm here to speak a little and to be the moderator of this panel on the reference points of security in the Western Hemisphere, in the Inter-American system, and how to make them more useful. I don't want to dwell too much on the Organization of American States, which is the big armature, because I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with it. So all I will tell you is that the Organization of American States, as you well know, is the oldest and the premier multilateral political forum in the Western Hemisphere, and it has 4 main pillars that guide its functioning. Now, depending who you ask, the order of the pillars will be different. In the case of Belize, if you ask me, the 4 main pillars are in this order: security, development, democracy, human rights. If you ask other people what are the main pillars, the order is invariably different. Under the Organization of American States, we have the Permanent Council, which is the highest political decision-making body that meets on a constant basis. And one of the main committees of the Permanent Council is the Committee on Hemispheric Security, which I am honored to be chairing for 1 year. The Committee on Hemispheric Security is the body that sets the policy direction for the entire organization on a regular basis. The committee is where the the resolutions, the declarations are negotiated on anything that has to do with hemispheric security. It is also the place where the big documents, the Declaration on Security of 2003, this is the place where they are negotiated. So it is the place where the ideas are trashed, where the thinking is shaped, and where eventually they are returned for implementation, along, of course, with the people of the Secretariat of Multidimensional Security led by Ambassador Adam Blackwell. Therefore, from the Committee on Hemispheric Security, there is a tremendous responsibility to set the so-called reference points. Now, to focus a little on these reference points, what are they? Well, we have clearly the resolutions that are negotiated. And this year, I am very happy to tell you that in keeping with the changing times of the organization, with the constant calls from the Secretariat, from the political bodies, that we cannot continue with business as usual in the face of ever more limited resources. We took a decision at the Committee of Hemispheric Security not to negotiate the 23 resolutions we should have been doing. Every year, there are a number of documents that are negotiated over a lengthy period of time. This year, we decided to do a single resolution. The resolution is already about 14 pages. I'm hoping it won't grow much longer than that. But if you think that in the past, almost every single resolution by itself had 14 pages, we went down from 23 to 1. We're hoping to finish negotiations on that resolution tomorrow. So we're very hopeful, and that's why I was a little late today, because when the people in the committee start working, they love their work so much, they get carried away, they don't want to stop. And then it does not help that we have a very limited time to complete our work. Therefore, this year we're doing a single resolution. The single resolution will try to provide in a very practical way the policy direction for the OAS for the following year. The other big instruments that we have clearly are the main reference points. We have the whole alphabet soup. We have CICAD that deals with drugs. We have SICTE that deals with terrorism. We have SIFTA that deals with the regulation and control of firearms and explosives and their manufacturing, etc., etc., etc. All of these, together with the declarations that are put forward by the organization and the resolutions that come out from the organization, provide the reference points for security. How do we make them more useful? That is the big question. I'm hoping that this very distinguished panel will guide us. But if I had my say in a nutshell, I would say that what we have to do is to stop negotiating fancy-sounding documents and start implementing them. We have already almost everything that we need in terms of the legislative, the political framework, if we're only able to advance in their implementation. Now, it's not as if anybody has decided we don't want to implement them. The reality is that in the face of very limited resources, and in the face of very conflicting interests, even in the face of many of these instruments that we have agreed, it is very difficult to move ahead. One of the big issues that is confronting us today, and I think it is very symptomatic of where we are, is this blurred area, this place where the issues of security and defense touch on each other. And it has becoming ever more difficult to be able to tell the difference. Because in many instances, the conception of defense has gone into the conception of security and vice versa. For a country like Belize, when we used to think about defense, we used to think about defending our borders. When we think about security, we also think about defending our borders. Today, we think of both of them interchangeably, and the enemy has evolved. The enemy is not somebody coming from outside your borders. Many times, it is coming from within, but they're also coming from without, Transnational organized crimes have no borders. They don't respect any borders. And they are as much the enemy as anybody who in other times would have been seen as a threat to our national security. It becomes more and more difficult to tell where the functions of one and the function of another ends. And I mention this because even as we're negotiating the single resolution for this year for the Committee on Hemispheric Security, being able to agree on big issues because of a latent suspicion, because of an indefinition, we have not yet determined where these concepts end, what are the impacts and scope of each of these concepts. Because we have not gotten to that clear-cut reality as yet, we are unable to agree on many issues. The interesting thing is that we recognize the threats generally. We're able to tell what those threats are. Our problem is we do not know how to address them. And it is very, very complicated. Unless we know where we stand as individual countries, we won't be able to know where we stand as subregions. And I say subregions because it is very difficult to think about the Organization of American States and its 35-country membership as a single unit, because it is very different. You have several constituencies within this 35-member nation. For a country of 100,000 people in the beautiful Caribbean Sea, the threats that they face are pretty different than for a country of 5 million living in the Central American corridor that is seeing its borders threatened by the cartels, by the drug traffickers. The level of the threat may be the same because both of them threaten the institutionality, the security of the state, the peace and stability and the well-being of its population. But the scope of the threat as perceived by the governing bodies is so different. A hurricane comes and it wipes out an island and that's it. And that's just Mother Nature. And in Central America, you get overrun by some organized cartels that you don't even know what hit you. And that is just the reality of the threats that we are confronted with. I don't want to get too much into these concepts because clearly we have the experts here to tell us. I just want to end by saying that if we are to move forward, what we need to do perhaps is to just step back a little. Step back a little and see what we have in terms of all of those instruments, all of the institutional armature that we have negotiated over the years. To take stock of what we have, where it can take us, and then we decide that for a moment, let's stop thinking of negotiating more and more documents, and let's start looking at how we can implement what we have already. If we agree to work together, if we agree to the best utilization, the best direction for the little resources that we have, I am sure that we will be heading in the right direction. So I want to stop there for now, and I'm very honored to introduce our first panelist this afternoon. I had the temerity of asking the doctor how to pronounce his surname because I wasn't sure. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dennis Skocz, strategic planning consultant and a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer. All of you have already a copy of his biography in the papers that were given to you, so I don't want to read what has been provided for all of us to see. Dr. Skocz will be speaking about a paper that he has authored, and we're waiting anxiously to hear what he has to say. Please welcome Dr. Skocz.
Thank you, Ambassador Mendez. It's really a delight to be here. I see many friendly and familiar faces in the audience. The issues on the program are ones that are maybe not friendly, but ones that are familiar to me in the time that I served as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, starting with my assignment to the Eastern Caribbean at the time of the Grenada Revolution. That's not the invasion, but the revolution, and extending up until my second assignment in the Pentagon, my last foreign assignment. And in between, I had the privilege of serving with Giovanni Snidel in some of the initial work on confidence and security building measures, and under the direction of Ambassador Luigi Einaudi. The title of my paper is stolen from the title of the panel, Making Reference Points Relevant and Useful. And before the start of the conference, I thought I would be saying some groundbreaking things and raising some really controversial issues. But after the first two panels, I'm rather persuaded that the added value of anything that I say in this paper right now will be to summarize some of the things that were said earlier, maybe to bring them into some framework, or to sharpen a couple points. But basically, I'm going to be looking at the framework, the reference points as they've been called, and then at some of what has been accomplished under the aegis of those reference points. And then finally, I'll be looking at some, I can't call them proposals because I don't have the authority or the standing to make proposals to the juridical bodies or policy bodies like the committee that Ambassador Mendez chairs, but ideas for the future. I should say that I don't speak on behalf of the U.S. government or NDU or any organization, that my comments are entirely private. And with that, let me ask your indulgence if I simply read this paper. I'm accustomed to 3-hour lectures as a adjunct professor, and if I were to extemporize, I would exceed my 20-minute limit, I'm quite sure. I may do that anyway. The title of the panel and the paper point to the issue that concerns us in this session of the colloquium. Are the instruments of inter-American diplomacy relevant and useful to the new security environment addressed by the Declaration on Security of 2003? What kind of security environment confronts our countries? What diplomatic resources can we draw upon to meet the challenges of a changed security landscape? And how can we tell if our diplomacy is successful? 3 changes have emerged in the political, juridical landscape as it relates to security. Number 1, the definition of security comes to embrace much more than traditional notions of defense. That is, as defense of national sovereignty and state borders from threats of armed incursion. A reading of the 2003 Declaration will show that there are at least a dozen conditions regarded as threats to security in the Declaration. These include such non-military, non-defense challenges as extreme poverty and AIDS. The Rio Treaty, to use an earlier reference point for comparison, identifies some 10 conditions or threats to security, but the 10 are all instances of aggression. The scope of threats or security-relevant conditions is clearly much greater today than many decades ago. So the first point is something that I think we all understand, many of us have said already today, and that is that the notion of security is very broad, very inclusive, and includes much more than defense, even though the borderline is so often very difficult to make out. Secondly, the nature of security-related diplomacy has also changed. There has been a paradigm shift from collective to collaborative responses. By collective security envisions a single, commonly perceived threat, usually an incident. Its general features are defined as precisely as possible in advance, so that when it occurs, there can be little doubt about the need to react. And reaction is the right term, since the paradigm envisions a common and swift response to the threat event. The common response is understood to be a joint action or set of actions to which all parties bind themselves. Collective security is conceived as automatic and compulsory. Collaborative security, by contrast, addresses a threat environment, not single incidents of aggression. It deals with trends and pervasive conditions with destabilizing effects that manifest over time. Collaborative security instruments, like the 2003 Declaration, seek widespread agreement from countries on the need to transform the security environment, albeit over time. These instruments envision a wide range of measures, indeed a menu of options, operating at different levels, multilateral, unilateral, bilateral, and multinational, to promote security. Collaborative security is voluntary, in essence, cooperation among the willing. So that's the second point that I would make, that the style of diplomacy or form has changed. The third thing is that the configuration of states for inter-American action has changed as well. And this is a point that has been made repeatedly today. A proliferation of multilateral organizations, generally sub-regional and task-specific, has arisen over many years. Some, like Mercosur, the Andean Community, and CELA, were formed primarily to further economic ends, development and trade. More recently, states are grouping to address security issues. A year ago, the presidents of Central America, through SICA, announced a regional security strategy to include efforts to combat transnational organized crime with the support of the UN. The 12-nation South American Defense Council, inaugurated in March of 2009, addresses a broad range of security issues. The Council's parent organization, if I may call it that, UNASUR, stands apart from some other groupings mentioned here in having a broad agenda that embraces everything from trade and development through policy coordination to security and defense. So then, how relevant and useful have inter-American reference points been to security in the hemisphere? Let me offer a concrete sense of the phrase reference points by suggesting what it covers. Under reference points, I include the following. First of all, documents, declarations like the Declaration on Security of 2003, and the principles and declarations of the 9 conferences of the Ministers of Defense of the Americas. Resolutions of the OAS General Assembly, for example, AG Resolution 1080, which provided for OAS responses to coups in Haiti, Guatemala, and Peru in the early 90s. Conventions like that on trafficking in firearms, which entered into force in July of 1998, agreements like the Central American Border Agreement of 2006, and of course treaties like the Pact of Bogota and the Rio Treaty. All of these together constitute the policy environment for cooperation in the hemisphere. One must next count organizations, from the Inter-American Defense Board and the OAS itself to political bodies like the Committee on Hemispheric Security and its supporting Secretariat for Multidimensional Security. Finally, and this is important, I think Claypack mentioned this, there is the habit and practice of cooperation in the region. I will cite some of these examples of such a habit in assessing actions under the aegis of the reference points. The point here is to underscore the cumulative effect of working together to address common problems. Each reference point, I suggest, is part of a constellation of points. Together, they guide and sometimes limit action among countries in the hemisphere. Given the shift to collaborative security as defined here, one commits a category fallacy, as logicians would call it, to measure the utility of today's security instruments by standards that apply to collective security actions triggered by event-based crises. Okay? How then do the reference points promote action, and what progress can reasonably be linked to them. At a theoretical level, the reference points underpin action by affirming shared values, support for representative democracy and human rights, the peaceful resolution of disputes, the rule of law nationally and internationally, common and collaborative action to address challenges and threats. Shared values enable action to protect or enhance those values. When such values are lacking, common action is stalled, if not paralyzed. And I'm thinking of some actions at the UN, for example, that become impossible to take or very difficult and time-consuming to initiate precisely because this environment of shared values is not there. The reference points also identify shared threats. Agreement on threats, from conventional cross-border aggression to terrorism, transnational organized crime, and poverty, is a necessary precondition for action. Finally, organizations enable and create a space for action, and the habits of cooperation enhance the agility and efficacy of responses. At a practical level, one can document numerous actions by OAS member states to address agreed-on threats consistent with shared values, either collectively or collaboratively. Let me offer some data points to go with the reference points. The examples highlight matters relating more directly to security and involving the military in non-combat roles. I do this to be consistent with the focus of our colloquium. One such example is the demining effort in Central America, which showed, inter alia, the role which the IADB can play using its military expertise in a non-combat humanitarian mission to save lives and restore land to production. The effort is a credit to participating countries of the region, and although not perfect, a model for applying the aggregate military experience of the IADB military officers from many countries around the region in relevant and useful ways. As a result of this and other demining efforts, the defense ministers meeting in Santa Cruz de las Sierras in November of 2010 were able to note that Central America is, quote, the first region in the world that is free from the threat of anti-personnel land mines. Secondly, I mentioned contributions of individual OAS member states to MOMEP and its work on the Ecuador-Peru border, which attested to inter-American values that predate the 1947 Rio Treaty, Pacific settlement of disputes, and it illustrated the creative application of military expertise and ground presence to a peace process under explicit diplomatic and national control. Lastly, I mentioned the participation of militaries from the region to MINUSTA in Haiti, which illustrates what can be done within the framework of collaborative security. In the words of the Miami Herald, MINUSTA shows how participating states of the region can be security exporting countries. Our attention in this colloquium falls especially on the Declaration of Security of 2003. Under the aegis of the Declaration, states are acting on many levels. And I can only pass briefly over these. We have unilateral actions to improve cybersecurity in military information and communications systems. Bilateral and OAS-supported measures to address trafficking in firearms. And sub-regional multilateral measures to deal with border management issues. If we are looking for evidence of implementation, the 2003 Security Declaration provides a virtual mountain of data, database of implementation as can be determined by the implementation or compliance statements of participating countries. This brief retrospective glance at collaboration is meant to energize thinking prospectively. What are some possibilities for collaboration relevant to the agenda of the 2003 Declaration, and concretely useful to states of the region. So now we come to some of the ideas that I thought were very provocative, but I think we have elements already in play. To give added concreteness to the question, I have chosen to refer to the IADB as the organizational site or venue of collaboration. In each case, however, the IADB can act only as a part of a coordinated effort led by the member states through the OAS and its political bodies. The prerequisites for legitimate common action are among the most widely overlooked aspects of organizing effective multilateral cooperation. Once again, the prerequisites of legitimate common action are among the most widely overlooked aspects of organizing effective multilateral cooperation. You need the juridical, political basis for doing anything among nations, nations which affirm the rule of law internationally as well as nationally. I invite you to think and comment on the following possibilities. Number one, the promotion of interoperability standards, measures, and training with a view to disaster relief. Now, we have elements of this as we saw in Southcom. Given the physical geography of the region and recurrence of natural disasters, notably hurricanes and earthquakes, it makes good sense to be as well prepared as possible. Past efforts have made use of military units in operations other than combat. Militaries have the surge capacity and logistics to respond quickly in an organized way to crisis situations. And so it is no surprise that they are frequently called upon to help. Having said as much, any organization can get in the way and impede efforts if it is not able to coordinate its actions with the host government and other entities. The possibility for consideration here is not that the IADB take an operational role in disaster response, but that it serve as a venue for encouraging interoperability among interested countries, militaries, by examining best practices based on lessons learned from past efforts. Having done this, participating militaries can then identify the tasks and corresponding capacities that are needed to carry out combined disaster response missions with civilian, military, state, and non-governmental actors. The identification of essential tasks and capabilities then sets the stage for addressing how to coordinate the capacities of different actors to enhance interoperability. The ambition of this project should be agreement on and dissemination of interoperability standards. So this is where we take it a little bit beyond exercises of the type that Southcom spoke of. These would not be compulsory, but serve as guidelines for countries thinking about offering the services of their militaries for natural disaster response missions. Tabletop, virtual, and field exercises designed to identify interoperability issues and test solutions would be arranged by the IADB or outsourced to willing board member defense institutions. That sounds like Southcom. Okay. Second option, second idea. After action analysis of military police cooperation in public civilian security operations in particular countries. Military police cooperation in public security operations is, of course, controversial. Cognizant of this, countries of the regions have nonetheless, on occasion, decided to engage militaries in efforts to maintain public security and address drug trafficking carried out by transnational criminal organizations. While this collaboration of military and police organizations in addressing public security and crime is a relatively new phenomenon, there are undoubtedly experiences, at least tentative lessons learned, to be gleaned in taking stock of experiences to date. The idea of such an assessment is raised for consideration without prior judgment as to the desirability or utility of such undertakings. The perspective is empirical. What has been the record to date of such collaboration? What forms has it taken? What kinds of division of labor between police and military have countries established? What rules of engagement and red lines? What have been the upsides and downsides of joint action? Is such collaboration understood as a stopgap measure pending development of stronger police organizations able to carry out public security and law enforcement tasks, ultimately without reliance on military organizations? Is international cooperation desirable? When it is, within what limits? I do not envision the development of standards based on such an assessment. This would be a step too far in my judgment for at least two reasons. The experience with which police-military interaction is, this experience is limited. Secondly, developing standards would appear to sanction a practice which remains controversial. The value of the hot wash I raise here for consideration is to capture experience of operations at their outset and in their early stages. Inter alia, an assessment of this kind can help countries anticipate unintended consequences for certain kinds of interactions and better sort out roles for the military and police. Countries, if they choose, can shape rules for engagement to avoid counterproductive and otherwise undesirable consequences that can result in such interaction. Finally, I want to suggest measures for border management and security. This third suggestion recognizes that border security is a function that devolves to both military and law enforcement organizations. At ports of entry, the police are in charge. When it comes to cross-border aggression, the military has the obligation to respond. Now comes the fuzzy area. The murky case involves incursions into national territory outside ports of entry. How does a country deal with incursions of its sovereign space by air or sea or by land that does not occur through established and resourced ports of entry? How does information sharing between military and police organizations help to perform their specific tasks better? When neighboring states have a record of friendly relations, are there benefits to be gained in sharing information on illicit cross-border trafficking at the strategic level? We already have some evidence of this today from General Braga Neto of Brazil. Perhaps the IADB or its supported organization can be a site for quarterly assessments of cross-border activity of interest to both law enforcement and military organizations. Unlike what already happens under the Jayat of South, the information shared would not be alerts of imminent incidents requiring immediate reaction. Rather, the information would be about trends. It would support strategic planning at the individual country level regarding allocation of human and material resources for the protection of its sovereign territory. A full assessment of inter-American instruments, organizations, and practice for security, for relevance and utility, requires much more than this short paper can deliver. My hope is that this overview will help to stimulate discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Skocz. I think we're starting to thread a little in the area of incursion into time. So we'll have the other two presenters, and at the end of the three presentations, we'll open the floor for any discussions that may arise out of the presentations. I am now greatly offered to offer the floor to a good friend, the distinguished ambassador of Mexico to the Organization of American States, Ambassador Joel Hernandez. He is a member of Mexico's Foreign Service since 1992. He has the rank of ambassador. He has a Bachelor of Laws from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a Master of Laws from New York University School of Law. I won't read any more of that. You have the full information that was provided in the paperwork that was given to participants. And I'm pleased now to offer the floor to Ambassador Joel Hernandez, who will be speaking about breaking with the fears of the past. Please Please welcome Ambassador Joel Hernandez.
Thank you, and I thank my good friend, Ambassador Nestor Mendez, for his introductory remarks. And I really hope that we are really breaking with the fear of the past, or at least I'll try to point out some minimum requirements, minimum elements that I think we as governments are necessary to follow in order precisely to have a more collaborative approach as the one suggested by Dr. Skocz in order to deal with new threats to national security. In the past weeks, we have been reading in the press the enormous challenges that one country of our region, Honduras, is facing against drug traffickers. We have also read the increasing cooperation between U.S. agencies and the Honduran authorities, but also the criticism arising inside Honduras due to the killing of 4 nationals by U.S. personnel, and that has questioned the role of U.S. personnel on the ground in Honduras. So the question remains, what should be the level of cooperation between countries in our region? And if such cooperation should be at the operational level, what should be the terms of such cooperation? Let me go a little bit into history and then try to give some comments on what we have ahead of us. I believe that sovereignty is the cornerstone of our multilateral relations. But also on the basis of sovereignty, each country adopts international commitments on security issues, and more importantly, on the basis of sovereignty, countries cooperate with each another. The concept of sovereignty has been enshrined in multilateral treaties, more precisely since 1988, at the time the UN negotiated the Convention Against Illicit Drug Trafficking, the Vienna Convention of 1988. I haven't found any other remote precedent of a treaty which has better reflected the need for the respect of sovereignty. And that's probably because the 1988 convention was a watershed in the beginning of a closer cooperation among states for dealing with drug trafficking. It was under the initiative of my country where Article 2 of the 1988 convention establishes the principles of equal sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-intervention in domestic affairs in order to comply with the obligations arising from the convention. And more precisely, paragraph 3 of Article 2 established that no party will exercise authority in the territory of other party which have been exclusively reserved to the authorities of that party under its national law. And probably this is the beginning of the fear in the 1988, when we are first coming to the realization that drug trafficking is a transnational organized crime and that the cooperation should also be transnational. But we have to be very clear of where are the red lines and what has to be done by each country. The same principle of sovereignty was later established in the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, November 2000, Article 4, and same happened in instruments adopted at the OAS. CIFTA, and Dr. Skocz was mentioning CIFTA in his presentation, dates back to November 14, 1997. Again, in Article 3, clearly establishes that a state party shall not undertake in the territory of another party the exercise of jurisdiction and performance of functions which are exclusively reserved to the authorities of that other state party by its domestic law. And same goes with SICTE, the Inter-American Convention Against Terrorism of the year 2002. So the concept of sovereignty is well established as the basis of international cooperation. But as I said, sovereignty has different applications depending on each state, and it's on the basis of sovereignty the way that one country decides to engage with others. The Declaration of Security of the Americas was another important watershed, and it broke ground in order to develop specific principles in order to advance that cooperation without losing sight of sovereignty. First of all, the Declaration of the Security in the Americas establishes a new concept of security in the hemisphere. And it is multidimensional in scope, includes traditional and new threats, concerns, and other challenges to the security of the states of the hemisphere. That's very important because at the region, this is the first time that we all agree on the multidimensional nature of security. Further beyond, the declaration also establishes the principles under which the international cooperation in the OAS shall be carried out. And the declaration also recognizes that each state has the sovereign right to identify its own national security priorities and to define strategies, plans, and actions for addressing threats to its security. Again, in accordance with its legal system and with full respect for international law and the norms and principles of the Charter of the OAS and the Charter of the UN. So far, this is already known. There's nothing new on that. However, the Declaration of the Americas establishes a very important principle. It recognizes that the new threats, concern, and other challenges are cross-cutting problems that require multifaceted responses by different national organizations, and in some cases, partnerships between governments, the private sector, and civil society. And this is a very concrete call for cooperation between states, more than the regular diplomatic cooperation, but one which is calling for partnerships between governments. How do we achieve the multifaceted responses between governments as suggested by the Declaration of the Americas? We have developed the basic concepts, and as Ambassador Mendez was mentioning in his introductory remarks, we also have the necessary documents. So we have to start working on the implementation of those instruments. And the question is how we advance in that direction in such a way that we can really achieve collaborative cooperation as suggested by Dr. Skocz. In my personal view, if organized crime is transnational, we also need transnational responses. But we have to depart from the fact that governments will be willing to work on the basis of recognition of national sovereignty. No single solution will be viable if that is imposed on a given state. We also have to depart from the fact that, from the principle of shared responsibility. And here in the region, we have very specific challenges which are of a hemispheric nature. Drug trafficking, trafficking of children, smuggling of migrants, trafficking of weapons. Those are